There's a photograph that exists in a private collection in rural Kentucky. It was taken in 1973. In it, 27 people stand in front of a white clapboard church. They're all smiling. They're all related. And according to the genealogist who first examined their family tree, they're all descended from the same two people who married in 1841. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Between 1841 and 1973, that family tree doesn't branch outward the way human genetics intended. It folds inward again and again and again for 10 consecutive generations. Cousins married cousins, sometimes first cousins, sometimes second. The line between family reunion and wedding ceremony blurred so completely that by the 6th generation, the children being born didn't just share a bloodline. They shared the same genetic code repeated over and over like a photocopier running out of ink. This isn't a story about royalty or ancient Egypt. This is America. This is Appalachia. And what happened in those hollows, tucked away from the census takers and the social workers, defied everything we thought we knew about human biology. Because those children should not have survived. The science says they shouldn't have made it past infancy. But they did. And the reason why is more disturbing than you can imagine. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not exaggerated. It's documented. There are medical records, birth certificates, testimony from doctors who examined these people and walked away shaken, unable to explain what they saw. This is the story of the Whitaker Fugate line, a name I've changed to protect those still living and what happened when human biology was pushed past every limit that it was designed to withstand. This is what happens when isolation, religion, and shame become more powerful than survival itself. The family's collapse into itself began with a man named Samuel and a woman named Mary Ann. They were second cousins who married in 1841 in a valley so remote that the nearest town was a 2-day walk through mud and timber. No one thought much of it. Second cousins marrying wasn't unusual back then, especially in places where the gene pool was already shallow. The mountains kept people in. The outside world stayed out, and families did what families had always done. They married who was nearby. Samuel and Marianne had 9 children. 6 survived past age 5. And here's where the pattern starts. Of those 6 children, 4 of them married within the family, not distant cousins, close ones. One son married his first cousin. A daughter married her mother's nephew. Another son married a girl whose grandmother was also his grandmother. The mathematics of it start to tangle immediately. The family tree stops looking like a tree and starts looking like a net, pulling tighter with every generation. By 1870, the second generation was fully grown. 12 adults. 8 of them married blood relatives. The ones who didn't marry into the family often didn't marry at all. There are records of sons and daughters who simply stayed home living with their parents until they died in their 40s and 50s, childless and isolated. The few who tried to leave the valley came back within a year. Some say it was loyalty. Others say it was something darker, a fear that the outside world would see what they'd become, and what had they become? That's the question no one wanted to ask. Because by 1890, the third generation was showing signs. Not obvious ones, not the kinds of deformities that would make headlines, but small things. A higher rate of stillbirths. Children who walked late or talked late. A boy born with 6 fingers on his left hand. A girl whose eyes didn't track movement the way they should. The family didn't talk about it. The local doctor, when he visited once a year, wrote careful notes in his ledger and said nothing to anyone outside the county. But the truth was already taking root. With each marriage between cousins, the genetic deck was being shuffled less and less. Recessive genes, the ones that normally stay hidden because they're paired with healthy variants, were meeting their twins over and over. The odds of inheriting two copies of the same broken gene, one from each parent, were climbing with every wedding, every birth, every generation that refused to let new blood in. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. By 1900, the fourth generation had arrived, and this is when the whispers started, not loud enough to reach the county seat, not loud enough to bring investigators or journalists, just quiet enough to stay inside the valley, passed between neighbors in low voices at the general store or after church on Sunday mornings. There were 17 children born into that generation. 11 of them survived infancy. Of those 11, 9 had something wrong. A boy named Jacob was born deaf in both ears. His sister couldn't grow hair, not on her head, not on her arms, nothing. Another child had a cleft palate so severe that feeding him required a special device the family carved from bone and leather. There was a set of twins. One died at 3 days old. The other lived to be 12, but never learned to speak, never made eye contact, never seemed to understand that other people existed in the room with him. The family called it slow. The doctor called it feeble-mindedness. Today, we'd recognize it as severe intellectual disability caused by genetic damage so profound it affected the architecture of the brain itself. But here's what makes this story so disturbing. The family kept going. They didn't stop. They didn't bring in outsiders. They didn't marry into neighboring families. In fact, they did the opposite. They pulled tighter. By 1910, 8 of the 11 surviving members of the fourth generation had married. 7 of those marriages were between first or second cousins. One man married his niece. Another married a woman who was both his cousin and his sister-in-law, widowed from his brother. The reasons for this aren't written down anywhere, but you can guess them if you listen to the silence long enough. Shame, fear, religion, the belief that what happened inside the family stayed inside the family. There were whispers of a preacher who told them that marrying outside the bloodline was a betrayal of their covenant with God, that their suffering was a test, that purity meant keeping the line unbroken. Whether that preacher existed, or whether it was just a story they told themselves, the effect was the same. The walls closed in, and with the fourth generation marrying into the fifth, the genetic damage accelerated. By 1920, there were children being born who shouldn't have been possible. A girl with translucent skin so thin you could see the veins beneath it like a road map. A boy whose bones were so brittle he fractured his arm reaching for a cup. Another child born without a fully formed cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls balance and coordination. She lived until she was 7, dragging herself across the floor because her legs never worked right. Her mother kept her in a back room. No photographs exist. The county birth records list her, but the death certificate says only natural causes. No details, no autopsy, just a grave in the family plot with a stone that says beloved daughter and no name. By 1930, the family had become something else entirely. The fifth generation was adults now, and the sixth was being born into a world that had no language for what they were becoming. This is the center of the spiral. This is where human biology, stretched to its absolute limit, began to make decisions on its own. Here's what the medical records show. The ones that survived, the ones kept in a locked filing cabinet in a clinic that closed in 1968. Between 1925 and 1950, there were 43 pregnancies documented in this family. 21 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Of the 22 live births, 9 children died before their 5th birthday. That's a mortality rate of over 70% when you combine it all. In the general population during that same period, infant mortality was dropping nationwide. Medicine was improving. Antibiotics existed, but none of that mattered here because the problem wasn't infection or disease. The problem was written into every cell. The surviving children from generations 5, 6, and 7 showed patterns that doctors at the time struggled to explain. There were 3 siblings born in the 1930s, 2 boys and a girl who all had the same condition. Their eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they couldn't tolerate sunlight, not sensitive to it, couldn't tolerate it. Exposure caused their skin to blister within minutes, their eyes to swell shut. They lived nocturnally, sleeping during the day, emerging only after dusk. The doctors called it photosensitivity. Today we'd recognize it as a rare genetic disorder called erythropoietic protophilia. It occurs when both parents carry the same recessive gene. The odds of 2 unrelated people both carrying it and having children together about 1 in a million. The odds when your first cousins descended from the same small gene pool almost guaranteed. Then there was the jaw. Multiple children across. 3 generations were born with a condition called mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw extends far beyond the upper, creating a profile that looks almost inhuman. It wasn't just cosmetic. These children couldn't chew properly, couldn't speak clearly. Some couldn't close their mouths at all. Their teeth grew in chaotic patterns, sideways and overlapping, because there wasn't enough room. One boy born in 1942 had to be fed liquids through a tube his entire short life. He died at 14. The family buried him at night. No funeral, no service, just a hole in the ground and a wooden cross that rotted away within 5 years. But the most disturbing part, the family was still marrying each other. Generation 6 married into Generation 7. A man born in 1935 married his first cousin in 1954. They had 4 children. 2 were stillborn. 1 lived 3 days. The 4th, a girl, survived, but she was blind, deaf, and unable to walk. She lived until she was 19, cared for entirely by her mother, never leaving the house, never seen by anyone outside the family. When she died in 1973, the same year as that photograph I mentioned at the beginning, the coroner listed cause of death as failure to thrive. That's a term usually reserved for infants, but it fit. Her body had simply given up. And yet, the family continued because by this point, it wasn't just tradition or religion or isolation. It was something deeper. It was the belief that this was normal, that everyone lived this way, that the outside world was the aberration, not them. Now, we need to talk about what was happening beneath the surface, because the real mystery isn't just that these children were born with severe genetic disorders. The real mystery is that any of them survived at all. When first cousins have children together, they share about 5% of their DNA. That doesn't sound like much, but it's enough. It's enough that recessive genes, the damaged, broken, or malformed instructions hidden in everyone's genetic code, have a much higher chance of meeting their match. When that happens, when a child inherits the same faulty gene from both parents, the body can't compensate. The defect expresses itself fully. Most of the time, this results in miscarriage. The pregnancy fails in the first trimester because the genetic errors are so severe, the embryo isn't viable. Nature has a built-in fail-safe. It stops the process before it goes too far. But in this family, that fail-safe was being overridden. And by generation 7 and 8, the children being born weren't just carrying 1 or 2 recessive disorders. They were carrying 5, 6, 7 overlapping genetic failures. Their immune systems were compromised. Their organs developed incorrectly. Their blood didn't clot properly. And yet, some of them lived. Some of them made it to adulthood. Some of them even had children of their own. How? There's a theory in evolutionary biology called genetic purging. It suggests that when a population becomes extremely inbred, the most severe genetic mutations get weeded out quickly because they're lethal. The individuals who survive are the ones who by sheer chance didn't inherit the worst combinations. Over time, the population becomes more genetically uniform, but also more resilient to the specific mutations that remain. It's a brutal process. It kills most of the offspring, but the ones who survive are in a strange way adapted to their own brokenness. That's what may have happened here. By Generation 8, born in the 1960s and 70s, the children who survived infancy were still sick, still struggling, but they were surviving at slightly higher rates than their parents or grandparents had. Not because the family was getting healthier, but because the genetic load had been, for lack of a better word, stabilized. The most lethal combinations had already killed everyone who carried them. What remained were the mutations that allowed for life, even if that life was painful, short, and limited. But there was a cost, and the cost was humanity itself. Several children born in Generation 8 exhibited something that terrified even their own family members: a lack of emotional effect, an inability to bond. They didn't cry as infants, didn't smile, didn't react to pain the way other children did. One boy born in 1967 was described by a visiting social worker as doll-like. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, his face blank. He could walk, could feed himself, but he never spoke, never played, never showed fear or joy or anger. His mother told the social worker he was touched by God. The social worker wrote in her report that the child appeared to have significant neurological damage, possibly affecting the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion and social connection. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By 1975, Generation 9 was being born. And this is where the outside world finally began to take notice, because some of these children were now attending school, or trying to. And teachers were seeing things they couldn't ignore. Things that made them pick up the phone and call the county health department. It started with a teacher named Linda Morrison. She's still alive, living in a nursing home in eastern Kentucky. And in an interview conducted in 2008, she described what happened in the fall of 1976. A girl was enrolled in her second grade class. The girl's name was Sarah, though that's not her real name. Sarah was 9 years old. She should have been in fourth grade, but she'd never attended school before. The family had kept her home. When Linda first saw her, she thought the child had been burned. Sarah's skin was mottled, discolored in patches, and her fingers were fused together on her right hand. Not all of them, just the middle and ring finger, grown together from birth. But that wasn't what made Linda pick up the phone and call the principal. It was Sarah's eyes. They were two different colors, one brown, one blue, with a cloudy film over it, and they didn't move together. When Sarah looked at the chalkboard, one eye tracked while the other drifted toward the window. The medical term is strabismus, often linked to neurological issues or congenital defects. But it was the way Sarah spoke that made Linda's hands shake when she dialed the county office that afternoon. The girl couldn't form full sentences. She spoke in fragments, repeated phrases she'd heard, and sometimes she'd stop mid-word and stare at the wall for 30 seconds. A minute, completely unresponsive before snapping back, as if nothing had happened. Absent seizures, petit mal epilepsy caused by abnormal electrical activity in a brain that had developed without the proper genetic instructions. The county sent a doctor, then a social worker, then another doctor, this one from the state. They visited the family's home, a farmhouse with sagging floors and newspaper covering the windows. Inside, they found 6 other children. Ages ranged from 3 to 16. All of them showed signs of severe inbreeding. The oldest boy had a skeletal deformity that caused his spine to curve so sharply he walked bent at a 45 degrees angle. A younger girl had feet that turned completely inward. The bones fused in the wrong position. She walked on the sides of her feet, had done so her entire life, and the calluses were thick as leather. Another child, a boy around 7, couldn't hear and communicated only in grunts and hand gestures the family had invented because no one had ever taught him sign language. The social worker's report, which was later leaked to a regional newspaper in 1983, described the home as inadequate but not abusive. The children were fed. They were clothed, but they were also isolated, medically neglected, and according to the report, educationally abandoned. The parents were interviewed. They were cousins, second cousins. They said, though the genealogical records suggested they were closer than that, they didn't understand why the state was involved. They said all the children in the valley looked like in this. They said it was normal. And in a way, they were right because the state investigators discovered that this wasn't one family. It was 6 families, all interconnected, all living within a 15-mile radius, all descended from Samuel and Marion. The genetic damage wasn't an isolated incident. It was widespread. There were at least 40 living individuals across 4 generations who showed signs of severe inbreeding. Some were children. Some were adults in their 30s and 40s. Still living with their parents, still unable to work or function independently, still invisible to the outside world. The state considered intervention, foster care, medical treatment, genetic counseling. But then something happened that shut everything down. The families lawyered up. A small-town attorney, himself distantly related to the line, argued that the state had no right to interfere with a private family matter, that the children were not being abused, that their conditions were unfortunate but not criminal. And in 1977, in a county courthouse that no longer exists, a judge agreed. The case was closed. The social workers were reassigned, and the families went back to the way things were. But the attention had consequences. 2 families moved away in the early 1980s. Where they went, no one knows. The remaining families became even more reclusive. They stopped enrolling their children in school. They stopped going to the county clinic. And when the 1990 census came around, several households simply refused to participate. The census takers noted the refusals but didn't push. And so, Generation 10 was born in silence, hidden, off the record, unexamined. Generation 10, born between 1985 and 2005. By now, the family had fractured. Some branches had left. Some had died out entirely, but a core remained. And in that core, the pattern continued. Cousins married cousins. The genetic spiral tightened one last time. There are no official medical records for most of these children, no school enrollment, no vaccination records. They exist in the gaps between documentation known only through whispered stories, through distant relatives who left and occasionally looked back with guilt or relief or both. But there are fragments. In 2003, a young man showed up at an emergency room in a town 40 miles from the valley. He was 22 years old. He'd been in a car accident. Nothing serious, but the doctors needed to examine him. What they found made them call in specialists. His bone density was that of a 70-year-old man. His liver showed signs of cirrhosis, though he didn't drink. His blood work revealed markers for at least 3 separate genetic disorders, none of which should coexist in the same person. When they asked about his family medical history, he got up and walked out. He was never seen at that hospital again. Then there's the story, unconfirmed but persistent, of a girl born in 1998. She was brought to a free clinic by an aunt who'd married out of the family and was trying quietly to help. The girl was 7 years old. She had the physical development of a 4-year-old. She couldn't read, couldn't write, could barely speak. But what disturbed the doctor who examined her wasn't the developmental delays. It was the scars, dozens of them, small and circular, on her arms and legs. The aunt said the girl picked at herself, that she'd done it since she was a toddler. But the doctor suspected something else, a condition called dermatillomania, a compulsive skin picking disorder often linked to severe anxiety, trauma, or neurological differences. The girl was referred to a pediatric psychiatrist. The aunt never brought her back. By 2010, the family had become a ghost. A few elderly members still lived in the valley, but they didn't speak to outsiders. The younger generation, those in their 20s and 30s, had either left or disappeared into the kind of poverty that makes people invisible. No social media presence, no public records, just rumors. A man who works third shift at a warehouse and never makes eye contact. A woman who lives alone in a trailer, her windows covered, who the neighbors say they've never actually seen, only heard moving around inside. And then there's the question no one wants to ask, but everyone wonders. Are there children in Generation 11? Did it continue, or did it finally mercifully end? The truth is, we don't know. There are whispers of a baby born in 2015, but no birth certificate was ever filed. There's talk of a young couple, both in their late 20s, still living in the valley, still together, still related, but no one's confirmed it. No one's seen them. The valley itself is emptying out. The church where that photograph was taken in 1973 burned down in 2007. The general store closed. The families that remain keep to themselves with a vigilance that borders on paranoia. What we do know is this. Somewhere in rural America, buried in county records and faded photographs, and the fading memories of people who are ashamed to speak, is the evidence of what happens when human biology is pushed past every boundary it was designed to withstand. These families became a genetic experiment conducted not in a laboratory, but in isolation across 160 years. 10 generations and countless lives that suffered for a choice, made long before they were born. The science tells us it shouldn't have lasted this long. The genetic load should have collapsed the line entirely by generation 5 or 6. But humanity is resilient in ways we don't fully understand. Even broken, even folded in on itself. Even trapped in a cycle of damage and repetition, life finds a way to continue. Not thrive, not flourish, but continue. And that might be the most haunting part of all. Because these people didn't ask for this. They were born into it. They inherited not just genes, but a legacy of silence, shame, and a kind of suffering that has no name. Some of them are still alive today. Some of them are watching this video. Maybe wondering if anyone will recognize the details, wondering if their secret is finally out. If you made it this far, you've witnessed something most people will never see. A story buried so deep that even now telling it feels like trespassing on sacred, cursed ground. Leave a comment, tell us what you think. Tell us if you've heard whispers of families like this in your own towns, your own histories. Because the truth is, this didn't just happen once. It's happened before, it's happening now, and it will happen again. Wherever isolation meets shame, wherever secrets become more important than survival. Thank you for watching, and remember, some stories don't have endings.